Welcome to all. XII Union High School and Junior College, Pune, Economics, Standard 12. Chapter 3B, Elasticity of Demand. Topic for today, Importance of Elasticity of Demand. So far, we have studied in this chapter the concept, meaning and definition of elasticity of demand. We also have studied that there are three important types of elasticities of demand: income elasticity, cross elasticity and price elasticity of demand. Along with this, we have studied the important methods to measure elasticity of demand, which are ratio method, total expenditure method, and point method. Lastly, we saw the factors influencing elasticity of demand. Lastly, today let us see how elasticity of demand plays an important role to the various sections in the society. So, importance of elasticity of demand. The first point of importance, elasticity of demand is important to a producer. Every producer has to decide the price of his product at which he has to sell it. For this purpose, elasticity of demand becomes important. If the demand for a product is relatively inelastic, he will fix up a higher price and vice versa. The concept of elasticity of demand is also useful to a monopolist to practice price discrimination. Second, elasticity of demand is important to the government. Taxation policy of the government is based on the concept of elasticity of demand. Those commodities whose demand is relatively inelastic will be taxed more because it will not affect their demand much and vice versa. Third point, elasticity of demand is important in factor pricing. The concept of elasticity of demand is useful in determination of factor prices. The factor of production for which demand is relatively inelastic can command a higher price as compared to those having elastic demand. For example, workers can ask for higher wages if the demand for the product produced by them is relatively inelastic. Fourth, importance in foreign trade. The concept of elasticity of demand is useful to determine terms and conditions in foreign trade. The countries exporting commodities for which demand is relatively inelastic can raise their prices. For example, Organization of Petroleum exporting countries have increased the price of oil several times. The concept of elasticity of demand is also useful in formulating export and import policy of a country. Fifth point, public utilities. In case of public utilities like railways, which have an inelastic demand, government can either subsidize or nationalize them to avoid consumers' exploitation. And lastly, proportion of expenditure. If the proportion of expenditure in a person's income is small, the demand for the product is relatively inelastic. For example, newspapers. If the proportion of expenditure is large, the demand for the product is relatively elastic. So these are the areas where elasticity of demand is important. Let us just have a quick revision of all these points once again. Elasticity of demand is important to a producer. The producer has to fix the price for the product that he has to sell. If the product that he sells has relatively inelastic demand, he can charge a higher price. On the other hand, a monopolist, that is a single seller, if he finds that the product that he sells has inelastic demand, then he can practice price discrimination, that is charging different prices to different consumers. Secondly, elasticity of demand is important to the government. The government collects taxes on the commodities. Those commodities which have got relatively inelastic demand, the government can tax more. Thirdly, the concept of elasticity of demand is important for factor pricing, prices for the factors of production. For example, if we take a factor of production like labor, that is workers, if the demand for workers for the product which they are producing has relatively inelastic demand, they can demand for more wages. Fourth point, elasticity of demand is important in foreign trade. For example, we have Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. What do we find? That always the demand for petroleum products or oil is rising. The demand is inelastic, relatively inelastic. Even if price for petrol rises, still demand is there. Means it is relatively inelastic. In such cases, by studying the concept of elasticity of demand, the foreign trade policies can be determined. Fifth point of importance, public utilities. Those services which are public utility have relatively inelastic demand like railways. In this case, the government can nationalize or subsidize such facilities so that exploitation of the consumers can be reduced. And lastly, elasticity of demand is important depending on the proportion of expenditure spent on goods. Suppose a very small proportion of your income is spent on certain goods and services or products which have inelastic demand. For example, you take newspapers. From our total income, a very small proportion of our income is spent on newspapers. So even if cost or expenditure on newspapers rises, still our quantity demanded will not fall. So it is relatively inelastic. proportion of expenditure spent from his income is very small, which is relatively inelastic. Whereas the proportion of expenditure spent from his income is large. In that case, the elasticity of demand will be relatively more elastic. Relatively elastic. So in this case, it will be relatively inelastic. In this case, it will be relatively elastic. Thus, we find that the concept of elasticity of demand plays an important role and has significance in our economy. Thank you.